Marissa Cole had no idea that the necklace resting against her collarbone was about to destroy everything she thought she knew about her life. But that morning, as she unlocked the back door of Maple and Main Diner, she touched it once, like she always did, and felt nothing out of the ordinary. Just cold metal, just memory, just the weight of a dead woman's secrets she didn't even know she was carrying. The sun hadn't fully risen yet. The sky was still that bruised shade of purple. Too early for most people, but not for her. This was her life now. 5:30 in the morning, every single day. Early, tired, and always alone. She didn't love this job. Let's be honest, nobody dreams of spending their 20s refilling coffee cups and scraping dried ketchup off vinyl booths. But the routine kept her grounded. It kept her sane. It kept her from thinking too much about how little had changed in the last 5 years. The diner smelled like it always did, burnt coffee, old grease, and that faint chemical tang of industrial cleaner that never quite masked the wear and tear of decades. Marissa moved through the space like a ghost, her movements automatic. Unlock the door, flip the chairs off the tables, turn on the lights, start the coffee maker. The machine groaned to life, sputtering and hissing like an old man waking up from a nap he didn't want to take. She watched the dark liquid drip into the pot, her mind somewhere else entirely. Her hand went to her neck again, brushing against the thin gold chain. The necklace. She touched it without thinking now. A reflex of comfort. The heart-shaped locket was small, delicate, and worn smooth from years of her fingers tracing its edges. She'd put it on the day her grandmother died, when she was 16 years old, and she hadn't taken it off since. The locket caught the early morning light as she moved, a quick flash of gold against her faded uniform. She never opened it anymore. The hinge was too delicate, too fragile. One wrong move and it might break completely. Besides, the photo inside had already started to fade. 2 women smiling at a camera, their faces growing softer and less distinct with time. But she kept wearing it, because somehow it made her feel less alone, like her grandmother was still there, still watching over her, still whispering in that warm, gravelly voice, "You're stronger than you think, baby girl." Marissa poured herself a cup of coffee, black, no sugar. She took a sip and felt the bitterness wake her up from inside out. "Another day, another dollar," she muttered to herself, her voice flat in the empty diner. Then she snorted, or 50 cents after taxes. She leaned against the counter and stared out the window at the parking lot, empty except for her beat-up Honda with a dent in the passenger door she couldn't afford to fix. The neon sign outside flickered weakly, buzzing like a tired insect. Maple and Main Diner. The letters had been missing their glow for months now. Today felt different, though. There was something in the air, something she couldn't name. Maybe it was the weather. The sky looked heavy, like it was holding its breath. Or maybe it was just her. Maybe it was the weight of realizing she'd just turned 27, and she was still exactly where she'd been at 22. Broke, invisible, running in place. She'd had dreams once. College, maybe. A life that didn't involve asking strangers if they wanted their eggs scrambled or over easy. But dreams cost money, and time, and energy she just didn't have anymore. The diner would fill up soon. Truckers stopping for fuel and breakfast. Road trippers stretching their legs. Locals who had nowhere better to be and nothing better to do. She'd smile. She'd refill their coffee cups. She'd listen to complaints about toast being too crispy or eggs being too runny. She'd collect her tips, count them in the back room, and go home to her cramped studio apartment that smelled like mildew and regret. And tomorrow, she'd do it all over again. But today, someone was going to walk through that door. Someone who didn't belong in a place like this. Someone who would look at the necklace around her neck and see something she didn't even know was there. Someone who would recognize it. Because 30 years ago, that same necklace had belonged to a woman who vanished without a trace. And the man who was about to walk through that door had spent his entire life searching for answers about what happened to her. Marissa adjusted her apron, tucked the necklace beneath her collar where it belonged, and waited for the first customer of the day. She had no idea she was about to meet him. The diner door opened at exactly 7:43 a.m., and Marissa knew immediately that the man who walked in didn't belong here. It wasn't just the suit, though that was part of it. Tailored, dark, expensive. The kind of suit that cost more than she made in 3 months. It wasn't the way he moved either, though there was something about his posture that screamed power, control, money. No, it was the car parked outside, sleek, black, gleaming like a knife in the morning light. The kind of car that had a driver. The kind of car that didn't stop at places like Maple and Main unless something had gone very, very wrong. The diner went quiet for just a beat. A trucker at the corner booth glanced up. Deb paused mid-pour. Even the coffee maker seemed to hesitate, its usual sputtering replaced by an eerie, watchful silence. Edward Langford didn't notice. Or, if he did, he didn't care. He hadn't planned to stop. He was on his way to a property acquisition meeting in Nashville. Another building to buy, another deal to close, another zero to add to his net worth. His driver had suggested they pull over for coffee, citing traffic delays and an early start. Edward rarely ate at places like this. Diners, gas stations, anywhere that reminded him of the world outside his empire. The world of ordinary people with ordinary problems. But his assistant had canceled last minute. His schedule was clear for another hour, and something about the flickering neon sign outside had made him pause. Maple and Main. It sounded familiar, though he couldn't say why. Like a name from a dream he couldn't quite remember. He stepped inside, and the smell hit him immediately. Burnt coffee, grease, old linoleum that had been mopped 1,000 times, but never quite came clean. It was the kind of place his mother might have liked. She'd always preferred the simple things, small diners, roadside stops, places where people knew your name. Before she disappeared, Edward pushed the thought away. He always did. 30 years of practice had made him good at it. He took a seat at the counter, pulling out his phone, already regretting the detour, already planning his exit. Marissa approached with a coffee pot, her smile polite but distant, professional, the kind of smile that said, "I'm here to do my job, not make friends." Morning. Coffee. Edward barely looked up. Black. No sugar. She poured. The liquid was dark, almost black itself, steaming in a chipped ceramic mug. He didn't thank her. She didn't expect him to. People like him never did. She turned to grab a menu from the stack behind the counter. And that's when it happened. The necklace slipped out from beneath her collar. Just for a second. Just long enough for the light to catch the gold. The engraving. The shape. Edward's hand froze mid-reach for his phone. His throat tightened. His pulse spiked. The world around him, the diner, the smell of burnt coffee, the low hum of conversation, all of it faded into static. Because he knew that necklace. He'd seen it 1,000 times. In old photographs, tucked away, in albums, no one looked at anymore. In his nightmares, the ones where his mother kissed him goodnight and then vanished into the dark. In the locked drawer of his father's office, the one no one was supposed to open, where a single photo remained, his mother smiling, wearing that exact same heart-shaped locket. That necklace belonged to his mother, and it shouldn't exist. Because when Catherine Langford disappeared 30 years ago, she'd taken nothing with her. No clothes, no money, no jewelry, especially not that necklace. Edward's breath caught in his chest. His hands, usually so steady, began to tremble. Who was this woman? And how the hell did she have his mother's necklace around her neck? Where did you get that necklace? The words came out low, controlled, but urgent, like he was trying very hard not to shout. Marissa's hand went instinctively to her throat. Her fingers closed around the locket, protective, defensive. She turned back to face him, confusion flickering across her face. "Excuse me." Edward leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked on the gold chain. The necklace, where did it come from? She didn't like his tone. It wasn't curiosity. It was interrogation, like she'd stolen something, like she owed him an explanation, like he had any right to demand answers from her. "It was my grandmother's," she said, her voice firm now, guarded. "She gave it to me before she passed." "Your grandmother?" Edward's jaw tightened. "What was her name?" Marissa glanced around the diner. Other customers were starting to notice now. The trucker in the corner booth was watching. Deb shot her a look from across the room. "You good?" "I don't see how that's any of your business," Marissa said flatly. Edward's expression shifted. The cold control cracked just a little. His voice dropped quieter now, almost pleading. "Please, Just tell me her name." Something in his voice made her pause. It wasn't anger anymore. It was desperation, raw and unfiltered. The kind that made people do irrational things. The kind that made them show up at rundown diners and interrogate waitresses about jewelry. Marissa hesitated. Then, against her better judgment, she answered, "Carolyn. Carolyn Hayes." Edward's face went white. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. His coffee cup wobbled, nearly tipping over. His hands were shaking, actually shaking. "That's impossible." The words came out barely audible, like he was talking to himself more than to her. Because Carolyn Hayes was a name that had been scrubbed from the Langford family records 30 years ago. His father had made sure of it. No photos, no files, no mention in any employee roster or tax document. No evidence she'd ever existed. She'd been his mother's closest friend, maybe more than that. The two of them had been inseparable, until the day Carolyn vanished without explanation. And 6 months later, his mother disappeared too. Gone. Both of them. Like they'd never been real at all. And now this waitress, this stranger, was standing in front of him wearing his dead mother's necklace and claiming it came from Carolyn Hayes. Marissa took a step back, uncomfortable now. "Look, I don't know what this is about, but I need to get back to work. That necklace belonged to my mother." The words hung in the air like smoke. Suffocating. Marissa stared at him. "What?" "My mother wore that exact necklace," Edward said, his voice tight. "It was custom-made, one of a kind, and she disappeared 30 years ago." Marissa's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't know what game this man was playing, but she wanted no part of it. This was insane. He was insane. "You're mistaken," she said, her voice shaking despite herself. "Open it." "What?" Edward's eyes locked onto hers, urgent and unyielding. "The locket. Open it. If I'm wrong, I'll leave. But if I'm right..." He paused, his voice dropping. "You need to see what's inside." Marissa's hands were trembling as she reached for the clasp. She hadn't opened the locket in years, maybe a decade. The hinge was fragile, delicate, and she'd been terrified it would break, that she'd lose the one tangible piece of her grandmother she had left. But now, with this stranger staring at her like she held the key to his entire life, she had no choice. Her fingers fumbled with the tiny clasp. Once, twice, then click. It opened. Inside was a photograph she'd seen 100 times, but never really looked at. Faded now, the colors bleeding into sepia. Two women mid-20s, arms wrapped around each other, smiling like they owned the world, like nothing could ever hurt them. One was her grandmother, younger, glowing, full of life in a way Marissa had never seen in person. Carolyn had always been tired, worn down, carrying a sadness she never talked about. The other woman, that's her. Edward's voice cracked. "That's my mother." Marissa's hands went numb. The locket felt suddenly heavy, like it weighed 1,000 pounds. She stared at the photo, then at Edward, then back at the photo. This can't be real. But it was. The resemblance was undeniable. The same sharp cheekbones, the same dark eyes, the same way her smile didn't quite reach those eyes, like she was hiding something even in her happiest moments. Where was this taken? Edward asked urgently. Marissa turned the locket over in her palm, her vision blurring. On the back, engraved in tiny letters she'd never noticed before, were 3 words. Langford Estate, 1993. Her stomach dropped. The Langford Estate. She'd heard of it. Everyone in Tennessee had. It was one of the most famous properties in the state. A sprawling mansion owned by one of the wealthiest families in the country. Old money, real money, the kind of money that bought silence and rewrote history. But her grandmother had never mentioned it, never said she worked there, never said she knew anyone named Langford, never said anything about her past at all. "Did your grandmother ever talk about my mother?" Edward pressed, leaning closer. "About the Langfords?" Marissa shook her head, overwhelmed. "No, never. She barely talked about her past at all." Edward pulled out his phone, his fingers flying across the screen. He stopped on a photo, his mother, standing in the exact same spot as the locket photo, wearing the exact same necklace. He turned the screen toward Marissa. This was taken 2 months before she disappeared. The room tilted. Marissa felt like the floor was falling away beneath her feet. This wasn't possible. Her grandmother was a quiet, private woman who worked as a housekeeper her whole life. She didn't have secrets. She didn't have ties to billionaires. She didn't have connections to disappearances and mysteries and 30-year-old tragedies. But the photo didn't lie. What are you saying? Marissa's voice shook. Edward's eyes burned into hers. I'm saying our families are connected. And whatever happened 30 years ago, whatever made my mother disappear and your grandmother go silent, it's still buried. And that necklace is the only proof left. Marissa's mind raced. Questions flooded her thoughts faster than she could process them. Why did her grandmother have this necklace? Why did she never talk about the Langfords? Why did she keep this photo hidden in a locket she told Marissa never to open? And most terrifying of all, what if Edward was right? What if her grandmother's past was tangled up in something far darker than she'd ever imagined? I need your help, Edward said quietly. I need to know what happened to my mother. Marissa backed away, shaking her head. I don't know anything. Then help me find out. Marissa's shift wasn't over, but she couldn't stay inside. The walls felt too close, the air too thick. The diner, her safe, predictable, boring little world, suddenly felt like a trap. She ripped off her apron and pushed through the back door into the parking lot, gasping for breath. Edward followed. Don't follow me, she snapped, turning sharply. I'm not trying to scare you. Well, you are. Her voice cracked, louder than she intended. You walk in here, accuse me of wearing your dead mother's necklace. And now you want me to what? Play detective with you? Dig through my grandmother's past like some kind of true crime podcast. Edward stopped a few feet away, hands raised in surrender. He looked different out here in the daylight. Less intimidating, more human, tired even. I know how this sounds, he said carefully. But if your grandmother knew my mother, if they were close, then maybe she left something behind. Letters, photos, anything. Marissa shook her head, her throat tight. My grandmother didn't leave anything. When she died, I barely had enough money to bury her. That wasn't entirely true. There was a box, a small wooden box her grandmother kept under her bed, filled with old papers and keepsakes. Marissa had never gone through it. It felt like trespassing on a life her grandmother wanted kept private. A life she'd deliberately hidden. But now, I'll pay you. Marissa let out a bitter laugh. Of course you will. That's what people like you do. Right? Throw money at problems until they go away. That's not what I don't want your money. She cut him off. I want you to leave me alone. She turned to walk back inside, but Edward's next words stopped her cold. My mother's name was Catherine Langford. She was 28 when she disappeared. The police ruled a voluntary disappearance. My father remarried a year later, and I spent my entire childhood wondering if she left because of me. Marissa turned slowly. For the first time, she saw past the expensive suit, past the cold demeanor, past the billionaire facade. She saw a man who'd been carrying a question his whole life. The same question she'd carried about her own parents, who left her with her grandmother when she was 6 years old and never came back. Why wasn't I enough? Why now, she asked, her voice softer. It's been 30 years. Edward's jaw tightened. Because I just found out my father is dying. And before he does, I need to know the truth. Silence stretched between them. The morning air was cool, but Marissa felt the weight of a necklace against her skin, warm and heavy. She thought about her grandmother's last words, whispered in a hospital room that smelled like bleach and death. There are some stories, baby girl, that are better left buried. But maybe buried wasn't the same as forgotten. Maybe some truths clawed their way back to the surface, no matter how deep you try to bury them. Marissa exhaled slowly. There's a box. My grandmother's things. I'll look through it. She paused, meeting his eyes. But that's it. After that, you leave me alone. Edward nodded. Deal. But they both knew it was a lie. Because once you started digging up the past, you couldn't stop halfway. You had to see it through to the end, even if the end destroyed everything. Marissa's apartment was everything Edward's world wasn't. Small, cramped, held together by stubbornness and hope. The kind of place where every piece of furniture served 3 purposes and nothing matched because nothing had been chosen. It had all been found, inherited, or bought secondhand out of necessity. She unlocked the door and immediately regretted letting him inside. Not because she was ashamed. She'd stopped being ashamed of her life a long time ago. But because having Edward Langford standing in her living room, in his $1,000 suit, with his perfectly styled hair and his aura of wealth, made the walls feel even closer, made the space feel even smaller, made her feel smaller. "Don't touch anything," she said flatly, tossing her keys onto the counter. Edward glanced around, his expression carefully neutral. "I wasn't planning to," but his eyes took all in. The couch with the worn cushions, the kitchenette that was barely big enough for one person, the stack of bills on the table she hadn't opened yet because she already knew what they said, the single window that looked out onto the parking lot, where her beat-up Honda sat next to his sleek black town car, like a punchline to a joke she didn't find funny. Marissa knelt by her bed, reaching underneath. Her fingers brushed against the wooden box, and for a moment, she hesitated. She'd never opened this, not once in the 11 years since her grandmother died. It wasn't hers to open. That's what she'd always told herself. These were Carolyn's secrets, Carolyn's life, and if she'd wanted Marissa to know about it, she would have said something before the cancer took her voice, then her breath, then everything else. But now, with a billionaire sitting awkwardly on her couch and a 30-year-old mystery hanging in the air between them, it felt like she had no choice. She pulled the box out. It was heavier than she remembered. Dust coated the lid, thick and gray, like time itself had settled over it. She set it on the coffee table between them. "I've never opened this," she said quietly. Edward looked at her, then at the box. "Why not?" "Because it wasn't mine to open." The words felt true, even as she said them. Like opening this box would be crossing a line her grandmother had drawn for a reason. Like some doors were locked because what was behind them wasn't meant to be found. But Edward was already leaning forward, his eyes fixed on the box like it held the answer to every question he'd ever asked. And maybe it did. Marissa took a breath and lifted the lid. Inside, old letters tied with string, yellowed with age, a faded photo album with a cracked spine, a small jewelry box, velvet-lined and tarnished, and a journal leather-bound, the cover cracked and worn, like it had been opened and closed 1,000 times. Edward's hand hovered over the contents, hesitant. "May I?" Marissa nodded. He reached for the journal, lifting it carefully, like it might disintegrate in his hands. He opened it to the first page. The handwriting was small, neat, deliberate. The ink had faded to a soft brown. The date at the top read, August 12, 1992. Edward began to read aloud, his voice quiet but steady. "Catherine gave me this journal today. She said I should write down my thoughts, that one day I might want to remember what it felt like to be happy. I told her I'd never forget, but she just smiled, that sad smile she gets sometimes, and said, 'We all forget, Carolyn. That's how we survive.'" Edward's hands trembled, just slightly, just enough for Marissa to notice. His mother's name, written in Carolyn's handwriting, felt like a ghost reaching through time, like the past had just walked into the room and sat down beside them. "Keep reading," Marissa whispered, because suddenly she needed to know. She needed to understand why her grandmother had carried this secret to her grave, why she'd never mentioned the Langfords, why she'd run and never looked back, why she'd kept that necklace hidden like it was worth more than gold. Edward turned the page. The journal was a window into a world Marissa never knew existed. Her grandmother wasn't just a housekeeper. She wasn't just staff. She was Catherine Langford's confidant, her closest friend, maybe the only person Catherine trusted in a house full of people who were paid to smile and keep secrets. Edward turned another page, his eyes scanning the words quickly before reading them aloud. September 3rd, 1992. Catherine is pregnant. She told me this morning, tears streaming down her face. She's terrified, not of the baby, of Richard. He's been distant lately, cold. She said he looks at her like she's a problem to solve, not a wife to love. I told her it would be okay, but I'm not sure I believe it. Edward's voice went tight, strained. "Richard, that's my father." Marissa watched as he processed the words. His jaw clenched. His eyes burned with something she couldn't name. Anger, grief, betrayal. All of it tangled together into something raw and dangerous. He kept reading. October 10th, 1992. Catherine asked me to hold onto something for her. The necklace. She said if anything ever happened to her, I should keep it safe. I asked her what she meant. She just smiled and said, insurance. The word hung in the air between them. Insurance. Insurance against what? Marissa asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Edward's voice dropped, dark and cold. Against my father. He flipped through more pages now, faster, desperate. His fingers left smudges on the fragile paper. But he didn't seem to notice. He was searching for something. Confirmation. Proof. The truth he'd been chasing his whole life. And then he found it. November 18th, 1992. Catherine is gone. Richard said she left in the middle of the night. Took nothing with her. The police aren't investigating. No one is asking questions. It's like she never existed. I tried to tell them something was wrong. But Richard's lawyer threatened me. He said if I spoke to anyone, I'd lose everything. So I ran. I left the estate, left Tennessee, and never looked back. Except for the necklace. I kept the necklace. The room went silent. Marissa felt the air leave her lungs. She ran because she was scared. Edward stood abruptly, the journal still clutched in his hand. He began to pace, his mind racing faster than his feet could carry him. She ran because my father made her. Everything he'd been told his whole life was a lie. His mother didn't leave. She didn't abandon him. She didn't walk out in the middle of the night because she couldn't handle being a mother. She was taken. Or worse. My father told me she abandoned us, Edward said, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. That she couldn't handle being a mother. That she was weak. That she left because she didn't love me enough to stay. He stopped pacing and turned to face Marissa, his eyes blazing. I believed him for 30 years. Marissa's throat tightened. She could see it now. The little boy who'd spent his whole life thinking his mother chose to leave him. Who'd carried that rejection like a stone in his chest. Who'd built an empire trying to prove he was worth staying for. What if she didn't leave? Marissa started, her voice barely a whisper. What if? She couldn't finish the sentence. But Edward did. What if he killed her? The words landed like a bomb. Because once you said it out loud, once you named the thing you've been dancing around, you couldn't take it back. You couldn't pretend it wasn't possible. You couldn't look away. Marissa stared at him, her heart pounding. You really think your father could have? I don't know, Edward cut her off. But I'm going to find out. He looked down at the journal in his hands, then back at the box on the table. What else is in there? Marissa pulled out the photo album next. The cover was faded, the edges frayed. The pages crackled as she turned them, brittle with age. Most of the photos were happy. Catherine and Carolyn at estate parties, smiling in their matching uniforms. Garden picnics on the sprawling Langford grounds. Catherine holding baby Edward, her face glowing with a joy that looked almost painful. Carolyn standing beside her, always just out of the center of the frame. Always watching, always there. Edward leaned closer, his eyes scanning each photo like he was memorizing them. Like he was trying to rebuild a version of his mother that didn't exist in his memories. But then Marissa turned the page, and everything changed. One photo was different. Catherine alone, standing by a window. Her face was pale. Her eyes were hollow, empty in a way that made Marissa's stomach turn. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't posing. She looked like she'd been caught mid-thought. And whatever she was thinking had drained the life right out of her. She looks haunted, Marissa said quietly. Edward took the photo from her, his hands trembling again. He stared at it for a long moment, his jaw working like he was trying to hold back words that wanted to claw their way out. This was taken right before she disappeared. Marissa turned the photo over. On the back, in Carolyn's handwriting, were 2 words. She knew. Knew what? Marissa asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted the answer. Edward looked up, his eyes meeting hers. That's what we need to find out. Because whatever Catherine knew, whatever secret she'd uncovered, whatever truth she'd stumbled onto, it had gotten her killed. And Carolyn had known it too. That's why she ran. That's why she never went back. That's why she kept the necklace hidden and never told Marissa the truth. Because the truth was dangerous. And 30 years later, it still was. The last item in the box was small, velvet-lined, and deceptively heavy. Marissa lifted it out carefully, feeling the weight of it in her palm. It looked like the kind of box that held a ring or a brooch. something precious, something meant to be cherished. She opened it. Inside was a key. Not gold, not silver, just plain, tarnished metal, worn smooth at the edges like it had been held many times. A small tag was attached to it with a piece of string. The writing on it faded, but still legible. LM47. What's LM47? Marissa asked, holding it up to the light. Edward's eyes widened. Recognition dawned across his face like a storm rolling in. Langford Manor, room 47. Marissa's heart skipped a beat. What's in room 47? Edward took the key from her, turning it over in his fingers like he couldn't quite believe it was real. My mother's old study, the room she used before I was born. My father locked it after she disappeared. His voice dropped. He never opened it again. The air in the apartment felt suddenly thick, heavy. If there's proof of what happened, Edward said slowly, his eyes still fixed on the key, it's in that room. Marissa swallowed hard. Then we go there. Edward looked at her, hesitation flickering across his face for the first time since he'd walked into the diner. My father still lives there. Marissa met his gaze, her jaw set. Then we go when he's not home. Because she was done running, done hiding, done pretending the past didn't matter. Her grandmother had spent her whole life running from this secret, and it had destroyed her, turned her into a woman who never smiled, who never talked about where she came from, who carried fear like a second skin. Marissa wasn't going to live like that. She was going to find out the truth, even if it killed her. Edward's penthouse overlooked the city like a kingdom. Marissa stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the lights below, thousands of them, stretching out in every direction, glittering like stars that had fallen to earth. She'd never been anywhere like this, the kind of place where the silence felt expensive, where the air itself seemed to cost money. The art on the walls probably cost more than her entire life. Abstract pieces she didn't understand, sculptures that looked like they belonged in museums, furniture so pristine she was afraid to sit on it. You live here alone? She asked, her voice small in the vast space. Yes. The answer is simple, final, like he didn't want to talk about it. Marissa turned away from the window and found Edward spreading a blueprint across the dining table, a massive slab of dark that could have seated 12 people. The paper crinkled as he smoothed it out, his movements precise, controlled. The Langford estate. Even on paper, it looked massive. 30 rooms, multiple wings, gardens that sprawled across acres. Security everywhere, cameras, motion sensors, guards who patrolled the grounds at night. It was a fortress, and they were about to break in. Room 47 is in the east wing, Edward said, pointing to a section of the blueprint. My father's bedroom is in the west. If we go on Thursday night, he'll be at a charity gala until midnight. That gives us time. Marissa leaned over the table, studying the layout. And the security? I still have access codes. I'm his son. He never revoked my clearance. Edward's jaw tightened. But we'll have a 2-hour window maximum. After that, the guards do their rounds. If we're still inside, we're caught. Marissa stared at the blueprint, at the lines and measurements and symbols that represented a world she didn't belong to. This was insane. Breaking into a billionaire's mansion to uncover a 30-year-old crime. Risking everything, her job, her freedom, maybe even her life, for a truth that had been buried for a reason. But she thought about her grandmother's fear. The way Carolyn had flinched whenever someone asked about her past. The way she'd looked over her shoulder, even in her final days, like someone was still coming for her. She thought about Catherine's disappearance, about Edward, growing up believing his mother didn't love him enough to stay, about all the lies that had been told and all the lives that had been destroyed to keep those lies hidden. And she thought about the necklace, the one piece of evidence that had survived, the one thing Carolyn had kept, even when she'd run from everything else. Let's do it, Marissa said. Edward looked up at her, something shifting in his expression. Gratitude, maybe, or respect, or maybe just relief that he wasn't doing this alone. Thursday night, he said, we find out what really happened. And this time Marissa didn't look away. The Langford estate looked different at night. During the day, it probably looked grand, impressive, the kind of place tour buses stopped to photograph from the road. But at night, with the moon half hidden behind clouds and shadows stretching across the manicured lawns. It looked like something else entirely. A fortress, a prison, a tomb. Marissa's heart pounded as they approached the side entrance. A service door hidden behind perfectly trimmed hedges, the kind of door staff used so they wouldn't be seen by guests. Edward punched in the access code, his fingers moving quickly across the keypad. The door clicked open. "How do you feel?" Marissa whispered. "Breaking into your own family's house?" Edward's expression was unreadable in the darkness. "Like I should have done this years ago." They slipped inside. The hallway was dark, lit only by the faint glow of emergency exit signs. The air smelled old, like wood polish and dust and secrets that had been locked away for too long. Their footsteps were nearly silent on the marble floors, but every sound felt amplified in the stillness. Every breath, every heartbeat. Marissa's eyes adjusted slowly to the darkness. Portraits lined the walls, Langford ancestors staring down with cold, judgmental eyes. Men in military uniforms, women in elegant gowns, all of them dead now but somehow still watching, still judging, still keeping score. "Which way?" Marissa whispered. "Upstairs, East Wing." They moved through the darkened hallways like ghosts, past rooms filled with furniture draped in white sheets, past a ballroom with a chandelier that caught the moonlight and scattered it across the floor in broken patterns, past a library with shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with books no one had read in decades. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like an alarm. Every shadow looked like a person. Marissa's nerves were stretched so tight she thought they might snap. But Edward kept moving, his jaw set, his eyes focused. He knew this house. He'd grown up here. He'd run through these hallways as a child, before his mother disappeared, before his father remarried, before everything changed. He'd been a prisoner here long before tonight. They reached the staircase, wide marble, curving up into darkness. Edward paused at the bottom, his hand on the railing. "Room 47 is at the end of the hall," he said quietly. "Once we're inside, we move fast. We find what we need and we get out." Marissa nodded, even though her hands were shaking, even though every instinct she had was screaming at her to turn around and run. But she didn't run. She climbed the stairs, and with every step, she felt like she was walking deeper into a past that didn't want to be found. The door to room 47 was heavy, solid wood, dark and worn, with a brass handle that hadn't been turned in 30 years. Marissa pulled the key from her pocket. It felt cold in her palm, heavier than it should have been. She slid it into the lock, her hand trembling. The key turned with a soft click. The door opened, and the smell hit them immediately. Stale air, dust, the scent of something that had been sealed away for far too long, like opening a grave. Edward stepped inside first. Marissa followed. Room 47 was exactly as Catherine had left it. Dust covered every surface, thick, undisturbed, like snow that had fallen and never melted. Books lined the shelves, their spines faded and cracked. A desk sat in the corner, papers still scattered across it. A pen lying at an angle, like Catherine had just set it down and walked away. But she hadn't walked away. She'd been taken. "Nothing's been touched," Edward said, his voice breaking. Marissa watched as he moved through the room, his fingers trailing over the desk, the bookshelf, the windowsill, like he was trying to feel his mother's presence, like he was searching for proof that she'd been real. Marissa moved to the desk. Among the papers were sketches, designs for a children's nursery, notes about baby names, written in Catherine's neat handwriting. Edward, Daniel, Samuel, a half-written letter tucked beneath a book. The ink faded but still legible. "Edward, look." He turned. Marissa held up the letter, her hands shaking. He took it from her, his eyes scanning the words. And then he began to read aloud, his voice barely a whisper. "My dearest Edward, if you're reading this, then I am gone. Please know that I loved you more than life itself. But I could not stay in a house built on lies. Your father is not the man the world believes him to be. And I have proof, hidden where only Carolyn will know to look. If you ever find this, find her. She'll tell you the truth. I'm sorry I couldn't be braver. I'm sorry I couldn't stay. Love always, Mom." Edward's legs gave out. He collapsed into the chair by the desk, the letter clutched in his hands like a lifeline, like the only solid thing in a world that had just turned to sand beneath his feet. 30 years. 30 years of wondering. 30 years of questions that had no answers. And here it was, his mother's voice, reaching through time, telling him she hadn't left by choice. Telling him she'd loved him. Marissa felt tears burn at the corners of her eyes. Where only Carolyn will know to look. She scanned the room. Books. Papers. A closet in the corner, its door slightly ajar. A bookshelf with a gap where something had been removed. And then she saw it. A loose floorboard beneath the desk. The wood was warped just slightly, like it had been pried up and replaced many times. Marissa knelt down, her fingers finding the edge. She pulled. The floorboard came up easily, and beneath it was a metal lockbox, small but heavy, covered in a thin layer of dust. "Edward," she said quietly. "I found something." Edward was beside her in an instant, the letter still clutched in one hand. He stared down at the lockbox like it was a bomb. The floorboard had come up easily, too easily, like it had been opened many times before, like Catherine had come here often, checking to make sure her evidence was still safe, still hidden, still waiting to be found. Edward pulled the key from his pocket, the same key that had opened the door. He slid it into the lock. It fit. The box opened with a soft click. Inside, bank statements, dozens of them, showing secret offshore accounts in Richard Langford's name. Transfers of money, huge amounts, millions of dollars, moving through shell companies and fake businesses. Evidence of embezzlement, evidence of fraud, photos. Richard with another woman, not Catherine, younger, blonde, smiling at the camera like she didn't have a care in the world. The photos were dated. August 1992, September 1992, October 1992, all before Catherine disappeared. And at the bottom of the box, wrapped in a piece of cloth, was a tape recorder. Small, outdated, the kind that used actual cassette tapes. "What is this?" Edward whispered. Marissa lifted it out carefully. The tape was still inside. She pressed play. For a moment, there was nothing but static, hissing, the sound of dead air, and then a voice, Catherine's voice, shaking, terrified, but determined. "It's November 15th, 1992. If anyone finds this, please know I didn't leave willingly. Richard has been threatening me for months. He found out I knew about his embezzlement, about the affairs, about the illegal deals. He said if I told anyone, he'd make sure I disappeared. Tonight, he said it's time. Carolyn is helping me. If this is the last thing I record, please find the truth. Protect my son." The recording clicked off. The silence that followed was deafening. Marissa felt the room spin, felt the air leave her lungs, felt the weight of 30 years of lies crashing down around them. Edward sat frozen, his face pale, his hands trembling. "He killed her," he said, his voice barely audible. "My father killed her." Because there it was, the truth, the answer to every question he'd ever asked. The reason his mother had disappeared in the middle of the night without a trace. She hadn't left. She'd been silenced. And Richard Langford, billionaire, philanthropist, pillar of the community, had gotten away with it for 30 years. Marissa looked at Edward, her heart breaking for the little boy who'd spent his whole life thinking his mother didn't love him, who'd built walls around his heart to keep the pain out, who'd become cold and ruthless because he thought that's what it took to survive. "We have to go to the police," she said quietly. Edward nodded, but he didn't move. He just stared at the tape recorder, at the evidence scattered across the floor, at the proof of his father's crimes. "We have to go," Marissa said again, more urgently this time, "before he comes back." But Edward's eyes had gone dark, hard, determined. "No," he said, "not yet." "What do you mean, not yet?" Edward stood, his jaw set, his hands clenched into fists. "I want to hear him say it. I want to look him in the eye and make him admit what he did." Marissa's blood ran cold. "Edward, that's necessary," he finished. "I need to hear it from him." Because evidence was one thing, but a confession was justice. And Edward Langford was done waiting for justice. They had 10 minutes. 10 minutes to get out of room 47, down the stairs, through the darkened hallways, and out the side entrance before Richard returned from the gala. 10 minutes to disappear like they were never there. But then they heard it. The sound of the front door opening. Heavy, deliberate. The click of expensive shoes on marble floors. Marissa's blood turned to ice. "He's early," she whispered, panic rising in her throat like bile. Edward's head snapped toward the door. His eyes went wide, calculating. "We have to hide." "Hide where?" Marissa hissed, her voice barely audible. The room was small. A desk, a bookshelf, a closet in the corner that probably hadn't been opened in 30 years. But it was too late to run. Too late to make it down the stairs without being seen. The footsteps were already echoing up the staircase. Heavy, deliberate, getting closer with every second. Richard Langford was home. Edward grabbed Marissa's arm and pulled her toward the closet. They squeezed inside, pressing themselves against the back wall. Surrounded by old coats that smelled like mothballs and dust and time that had stopped moving. Edward pulled the door closed, leaving it open just a crack. Just enough to see through. Marissa's heart pounded so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps. She pressed her hand over her mouth, trying to quiet the sound, trying to disappear into the darkness. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. Then they stopped. Silence. Marissa could hear her own pulse in her ears, a frantic drumbeat that matched the terror coursing through her veins. And then the footsteps started again. Slower now, more deliberate, like whoever was walking knew exactly where they were going. Toward room 47. The door creaked open. Light flooded the room, dim, yellow from the hallway sconces. A shadow fell across the threshold, long and dark and impossibly tall. And then Richard Langford stepped inside. He was older than the photos Marissa had seen. Grayer. His hair was silver now, swept back from a face that was still sharp, still commanding, still cold. He wore a tuxedo, crisp, perfect, expensive. Like he'd just come from an event where people smiled and shook his hand and told him how generous he was. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, his eyes scanning the room, taking in the open lockbox, the scattered documents, the tape recorder sitting on the desk like a loaded gun. His expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Recognition, realization, anger. "Edward," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "I didn't expect you." Edward pushed the closet door open and stepped out. Marissa followed, her legs shaking, her heart still racing. Richard's eyes shifted to her, cold, appraising, like she was something he needed to deal with. A problem, a witness, a loose end. "Who's this?" Richard asked, his tone casual. Too casual. Edward didn't answer. He stepped forward, the tape recorder clutched in his hand. And for the first time in 30 years, father and son stood face to face. "Where is she?" Edward's voice was low, controlled, but there's something underneath it, something dangerous, something barely held in check. Richard tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "I don't know what you're talking about." "My mother." Edward took another step forward. "Where did you bury her?" The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's expression didn't change. Not a flicker, not a crack, but his silence said everything. It screamed guilt. It screamed calculation. It screamed 3 decades of lies that were finally catching up to him. "You shouldn't have come here," Richard said finally, his voice flat. Edward held up the tape recorder. "I have recordings, bank statements, proof of everything you did." He paused, his jaw clenched. "I know what you did to her." Richard's eyes narrowed. For a moment, he looked almost amused, like this was a game he'd already won. "And what will you do with it?" he asked, his tone mocking now. "Ruin the family name? Destroy everything I built? Everything you've benefited from your entire life? You destroyed it the moment you killed her." The words hung in the air like a verdict. Richard's mask finally cracked, his composure shattered. His face twisted, anger, contempt, something that looked almost like pride. He laughed, but it was a bitter, ugly sound. "She will go and take everything from me," he spat, his voice rising now. "The company, the estate, my reputation, everything I worked for, everything I built from nothing." "She was your wife," Edward said, his voice shaking. "The mother of your child." "She was a problem," Richard shot back. "A problem that needed to be solved." Marissa felt sick. She wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there and listen to this man, this monster, talk about Catherine like she was nothing more than an inconvenience. I gave her a choice, Richard continued, his voice cold now, clinical, like he was describing a business transaction. Leave, quietly disappear, never come back, or face the consequences. And she chose to fight, Edward said. Richard's smile was sharp, cruel. She chose wrong. The room seemed to tilt. Marissa grabbed the edge of the desk to steady herself. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind. There's some stories, baby girl, that are better left buried. But this story had clawed its way out of the ground, and now there was no putting it back. How did you do it? Edward asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Richard shrugged, like the answer was obvious. I made her disappear. It wasn't difficult. A few calls, a few favors, money in the right hands. The police ruled it a voluntary disappearance. Case closed. He paused, his eyes glinting. And then I remarried, moved on, built an empire. And Carolyn? Marissa asked, her voice shaking. What about my grandmother? Richard's gaze shifted to her, cold and dismissive. She was a witness, a loose end. I had my lawyers threaten her, told her if she talked, she'd lose everything. Her job, her home, her freedom. He smiled. She ran like a coward. She ran because she was terrified. Marissa shot back. Because you destroyed her life. She should have kept her mouth shut. Edward's hands clenched into fists. His entire body was shaking now with rage, with grief, with 30 years of unanswered questions finally finding their answers. And then slowly, deliberately pulled out his phone. What are you doing? Richard asked, his tone sharp now. Edward turned the screen toward him. A red recording icon blinked at the top. I recorded everything. Richard's face went white. For the first time since he'd walked into the room, he looked afraid. Richard lunged for the phone, but Edward stepped back, holding out of reach. You can't, Richard started, his voice rising. I already sent it, Edward said flatly. To the police, to the press, to every lawyer I know. Richard's face twisted. You don't know what you've done. I know exactly what I've done. Edward's voice was steel. I'm making sure you pay for what you did. Richard staggered back, his composure completely shattered now. He looked older suddenly, smaller, like the weight of his crimes had finally caught up to him and crushed him under their weight. She found out about the embezzlement, Edward continued, his voice steady now. She found the offshore accounts, the fake businesses, the illegal deals, and she was going to expose you. Richard said nothing, but his silence was confirmation enough. So you killed her, Edward said. You made her disappear. You paid off the police, the investigators, anyone who might ask questions. And then you locked up her room and pretended she never existed. Richard's jaw tightened. She would have destroyed everything. You destroyed everything, Marissa said, her voice breaking. You destroyed my grandmother. You destroyed your wife. You destroyed your son. Richard's eyes flicked to her, cold and venomous. Your grandmother should have kept her mouth shut. She knew too much. She saw too much. She ran for her life. Marissa shot back. Because you threatened her. Because you made her believe that if she talked, you'd kill her too. I would have. The words were so casual, so matter-of-fact, that they sucked all the air out of the room. Edward stared at his father, his face pale. You're a monster. Richard laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. I'm a survivor. I did what I had to do to protect what was mine. She wasn't yours to kill. The words landed like a blow. Richard said nothing. He just stood there, his mask finally gone, his true face exposed. A man who'd spent 30 years building an empire on lies and blood. A man who'd gotten away with murder. Until now, from somewhere outside, the sound of sirens cut through the night. The police arrived within 20 minutes. Edward had already sent everything. The recordings, the documents, the bank statements, the photos. Everything Catherine had hidden. Everything Carolyn had kept safe. 30 years of evidence, finally brought into the light. Marissa stood at the window, watching as officers swarmed the estate. Red and blue lights flashed across the manicured lawns, turning the mansion into a crime scene. Richard Langford was let out in handcuffs. He didn't look back, didn't say a word, just walked with his head down, his hands cuffed behind his back, his empire crumbling around him. Billionaire, philanthropist, murderer, finally being held accountable. Marissa felt Edward step up beside her. They stood together in silence, watching as the police cars pulled away, taking Richard into custody, taking him toward a reckoning that was 30 years overdue. "It's over," Marissa said quietly. Edward nodded, but his eyes were distant, lost, because it wasn't really over. Not for him. His mother was still gone. His childhood was still broken. The man he'd looked up to his entire life was still a monster. But at least now there was justice. At least now there was truth. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. 3 weeks later, they found her, buried on the estate grounds, beneath a rose garden she'd once loved. The garden where she used to take Edward when he was a baby, where she'd sit on a blanket and read to him while the flowers bloomed around them. Richard had buried her there, in the place she loved most. A final cruel insult. The forensic team worked carefully, respectfully. They uncovered her remains, what was left after 30 years in the ground. A skeleton wrapped in the remnants of a dress, a wedding ring still on her finger. Edward stood at the edge of the garden, watching, silent. His face was a mask, but Marissa could see the cracks in it, the grief, the relief, the finality of it all. His mother was gone, really truly gone, not missing, not lost, not living some secret life somewhere far away, dead, murdered. But at least now he knew. The funeral was small, private, just Edward, a handful of family members who hadn't sided with Richard and Marissa. They buried Catherine in a cemetery on the other side of town, far from the estate, far from a place where she died. The headstone was simple. Catherine and Langford, beloved mother gone, but never forgotten. Edward stood at the grave long after everyone else had left. Marissa stayed with him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "She would have been proud of you," Marissa said quietly. Edward didn't answer. He just stared at the headstone, his jaw tight, his eyes red. And then finally he spoke. "I hope so." Marissa didn't keep the necklace. She gave it to Edward, so he could bury it with his mother. It belonged with Catherine. It always had. But she kept the photo, the one of Catherine and Carolyn, arms around each other, smiling like the world couldn't touch them, like they had no idea what was coming, like they still believed in happy endings. Marissa kept it as a reminder of her grandmother's strength, of Catherine's bravery, of the truth that had finally clawed its way into the light. She and Edward stood together outside the cemetery gates, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the grass. "Thank you," Edward said quietly. Marissa looked at him. "For what?" "For helping me find the truth." She shook her head. "You would have found it eventually. Maybe. But I wouldn't have survived it alone." They stood in silence for a moment. Two people bound by tragedy but freed by the truth. Two people who'd started as strangers and become something else. Allies. Friends. Maybe more someday. Edward took a breath, deep, shuddering, like he was breathing for the first time in 30 years. "I can finally breathe," he said, almost himself. Marissa smiled. "Just a little. So can I." Because the weight was gone. The secrets, the lies, the fear that had followed both their families for 3 decades. It was over. And for the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel like something to survive. It felt like something to live. They walked away from the cemetery together, side by side, leaving the past where it belonged, buried, but not forgotten. And as they disappeared into the fading light, one thing was clear. Some truths are worth fighting for. Some stories are worth telling. And some secrets, no matter how deep they're buried, will always find their way back to the surface. Because the truth doesn't stay hidden forever. It just waits. And when the time is right, it comes back with a vengeance.